Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a historical and esoteric detective story that spans literally thousands of years. It's a massive puzzle that weaves together suppressed ancient texts, fierce debates among early theologians, and a highly controversial spiritual theory that challenges everything we think we know about the origins of evil on Earth. So, let's get right into it.
To unravel this whole mystery, we actually have to start with a massive historical question. Why did the early church deliberately ban the Book of Enoch and brand it as outright heresy? Well, the answer isn't just about obscure theology. It's because that text contained a terrifying and deeply dangerous idea about the true nature of fallen angels. It presented a reality that early religious authorities found, quite frankly, far too threatening to leave in the hands of the public.
Okay, let's dive into this. The mainstream view today is that angels, whether they're holy or fallen, are simply shadowy, invisible spirits, right? But the Book of Enoch, which is a major apocryphal text from antiquity, tells a completely different story. It introduces this wild concept that these beings were not immaterial phantoms at all. When they descended to Earth, they were dense, physical, flesh and blood entities. They literally walked among us.
This brilliantly illustrates the biblical precedent for that exact materiality. You've probably heard the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel. But according to the text, Jacob's opponent wasn't just a wisp of wind or some kind of spiritual hallucination. This being was solid enough to physically wrestle a grown man all night long and ultimately cripple Jacob's thigh. That takes serious physical force.
In fact, if you really comb through the ancient texts, the evidence of physical angels is everywhere. Take Manoah, who casually offered to cook dinner for a guest, only to realize later the man was actually an angel of the Lord. Or consider the angels visiting Sodom. They were locked indoors by Lot to protect them from a very real, physical assault by the local townspeople. These sources consistently depict tangible, physical beings engaging in distinctly human activities.
Now you might be wondering, how exactly does a celestial being become flesh? Esoteric teachings describe a fascinating process that we can call vibrational deceleration. The concept here is that when these spiritual beings rebelled, or when they succumbed to earthly desires, they could no longer sustain their high spiritual frequencies. So, they literally fell in vibration. They descended from the planes of spirit down into the incredibly dense planes of matter, which forced them to take on mortal physical bodies subject to the very real laws of karma.
Part 1. A Tale of Two Falls. Pride versus Lust. According to the sources, there wasn't just one angelic rebellion, but two entirely separate events. Now, what's really interesting about this is how these two massive events brought these beings to Earth. The first, original fall, was the rebellion led by Lucifer, an event that actually occurred long before the creation of humanity. The esoteric texts describe a galactic battle where Archangel Michael forces these rebel angels out of the heavens, casting them down to the physical planes of Earth, where they were forced to take on physical form. Early theologians like Aphrahat even suggested Lucifer physically incarnated on Earth as the tyrant king Nebuchadnezzar.
But the sources make a massive distinction between this first fall and the second one. See, the first fall, the Luciferian rebellion, was basically a mental sin. It was a fall through intellectual pride and a desire for absolute self-sufficiency. But much later, a completely different group of angels, called the Grigori or the Watchers, committed a completely different sin. Led by figures like Samyaza and Azazel, their fall was physically driven. They looked at humanity, developed an insatiable lust for the daughters of men, and voluntarily descended onto Mount Hermon to fulfill those carnal desires.
If you're wondering how these two totally different falls got jumbled together in history, Hebrew scholar Julian Morgenstern provides a fascinating proof. He points out that the famous Genesis 6 passage perfectly synthesizes these two distinct falls. It casually mentions that the Nephilim were already on the earth. Those are the beings from the first fall of pride. At the exact same time, the sons of God came down to mate with human women, which represents the second fall of lust. It's like a giant puzzle finally fitting together.
And the consequences of that second fall were devastatingly physical. The Watchers didn't just observe humanity, they actively interbred with human women, acting as a catalyst for genetic manipulation. This dark union produced a race of physical, hybrid giants known as the Nephilim. And it gets worse. These Watchers broke celestial laws by teaching humanity forbidden arts, things like advanced weaponry, metallurgy, cosmetics, and sorcery. They essentially jump-started an age of war, vanity, and deep corruption on Earth.
This physical interbreeding brings us to a fascinating subtopic, the myth of the genderless angel.
While modern mainstream theology assumes angels are entirely non-sexual and male-presenting, ancient esoteric sources firmly assert that these immortals were originally created as sexual beings, both male and female.
Textual proof of female entities actually exists right in the scriptures. For instance, there are two supernatural winged women described on a divine mission in the book of Zechariah. There's also the legend of Lilith, mentioned as a wilderness spirit in Isaiah. Esoteric sources describe her not just as a mere demon, but as a prominent fallen female angel. According to these traditions, just as male fallen angels mated with women, female fallen angels have historically mated with human males to defile the human genome. The sources even claim that high-level occultists in secret societies, like the Palladium, have historically undergone dark satanic weddings to physically mate with these entities. Truly wild stuff.
Part 2. Theological Cover-Up, the 4th Century Debate. So why is all of this completely absent from modern teaching?
Well, the early church fathers actually engaged in a fierce, high-stakes debate over these embodied beings. Ultimately, the later church found the idea of physical angels way too terrifying and completely unmanageable. They had a massive problem on their hands. If angels fell through lust, they required physical bodies to commit that sin. But if they fell solely through pride, which is just a sin of the mind, they didn't need bodies at all. The church deliberately chose the latter, completely redefining fallen angels as immaterial, bat-winged demons who could only whisper evil thoughts rather than flesh and blood elites walking among us.
So the crucial point here is this. By banning the Book of Enoch and adopting St. Augustine's non-physical view of demons, the church effectively erased the threat. They swept the terrifying reality of physical angels right under the rug. And more importantly, it allowed them to shift the blame. The origin of evil was moved away from a supernatural physical invasion and placed squarely on the shoulders of humanity through the doctrine of original sin.
Part 3. The living dead among us, an ongoing threat. But here's the thing. The esoteric texts say this theological cover-up didn't make the physical angels magically disappear. In fact, it leads us to the final and perhaps most provocative climax of this whole explainer, the deeply held esoteric belief that these physical beings never actually left. This is the concept of continuous re-embodiment. According to esoteric teachings, because these entities were bound to the physical plane, their incarnation wasn't just some one-time historical event before the flood. Instead, the fallen angels and the spirits of the Nephilim have been looping through earthly incarnations, reincarnating as humans without interruption for hundreds of thousands of years, right up to the present day. But they are fundamentally different from normal human souls. Because they rebelled, the sources say they cut themselves off from the divine source. They are completely devoid of inner, spiritual energy, which has led esoteric scholars to describe them as the living dead. They don't just come back randomly either. They often reincarnate together in tight karmic groups, like syndicates or historical cohorts, returning lifetime after lifetime with an absolute unified dedication to subvert humanity. And because they are spiritually hollow, literally having no divine light of their own, they have to survive by acting as spiritual parasites. They literally have to harvest and siphon the light and life force from humanity. To do this on a massive scale, they have to put themselves in positions of absolute control. Let's move on and see how this builds into our modern reality. To harvest this energy on a global scale, the sources claim these reincarnated entities naturally gravitate to the absolute top echelons of earthly power. We're talking about global finance, political elites, massive media empires, and even the top ranks of church hierarchies. By controlling the system from the top down, they promote a matrix of pure materialism, warfare, fear, and systemic corruption. These are environments specifically designed to extract human energy and crush the human spirit.
Whether you view these esoteric texts as literal truth or just a profound allegory, the parallels are undeniably striking. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is the ancient suppressed story of the living dead, soulless elites draining humanity for their own survival, just an archaic myth? Or is it the most terrifyingly perfect metaphor ever created to explain the greed, the endless wars, and the massive abuses of power we see in the modern world today? I'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.